Ghostlore, due for early access release in March of this year through indie developers Andrew Teo and Adam Teo, is a game that describes itself as an Eastpunk action RPG centered on the concept of fighting Southeast Asian inspired folklore monsters. Which means it's already ticking some boxes for me. I have to be honest, it's been a good long while since I jumped into anything RPG related, to the point that I can't even remember the last game of this particular style that I even played. As cliched as it sounds, the most recent RPG that I managed to stick with was probably my biannual replay of the classic Final Fantasy VII, because, like the Sony PS1 fanboy that I am, I adore that game more and more with each and every new playthrough. It's like a comfort blanket, what can I say? However, when the developer of Ghostlore reached out to offer a review code with this absolute hook of an email header, and also attached a brief clip of in-game dialogue to showcase Ghostlore's colourfully intense style of action, it caught my attention very effectively. I'm a sucker for spooky mythology and creepy folk stories, so the idea of a Diablo-esque experience focusing on fighting monsters from Malaysian, Chinese and Indonesian folklore was always going to be one that next snapped my head around with interest. Aside from Detention or Devotion and certain other indie titles, there really isn't enough of that kind of thing around in the gaming world these days, especially when you compare it to the amount of material originating from the West. So to see something new that isn't just a video game adaptation of The Grudge, The Ring, or some other established J-horror property is always nice to see. And seeing as the Milk Outside a Bag of Milk and Lord of the Rings videos are now finished, I figured now would be a pretty good time to break that non-RPG streak of my recent gaming history. So, for today's video, let's take a look at Ghostlore, which again, let me be clear, is a title that I'm very much reviewing in its beta stage. So this is going to be more along the lines of a first impressions kind of video as opposed to a full-blown review. The early access release due in March is, at least according to the developer's projected timeline, still a good few months away from the anticipated full release in August, which means there is a lot of time left to fine-tune this experience from the one I'm now about to go through. But with that being said, let me just break the first egg and admit that, well, I like this game. And I kinda like it a lot.
No, don't hurt the chickens!
So, true to form of a lot of RPGs out there in the world, your first step into the realm of Ghostlore is to select one preferred class out of the 6 available to choose from, which ranges from your standard Adept, or in other words the melee class, to the Exorcist, or in simpler terms a Mage, and 4 other alternatives: the Geomancer, the Hashashin, the Feral, and the Sentinel. But for the purpose of today's video, we're just going to focus on the first 2, my initial run as the Adept, and my secondary run as the Exorcist. And right off the bat, even in spite of only having played through 2 of the 6, I was pretty pleasantly surprised at how different a playing style these 2 classes offered when compared with each other. As you might expect of a melee-focused character, the Adept is far more grounded, with much of your time with the class being spent using swords, knives, spears, and so forth, while also spending a lot of time dodging and weaving through enemies in order to preserve your health. Whereas on the other hand, the Exorcist works best with such weapons as the Talismans, a projectile-based magic weapon cast in the direction of enemies to inflict as much damage as possible from a distance. And yet, that's not to say you can't mix and match weapons that were designed for one class with another. If you really want them to, the Adept will more than happily start flinging talismans around, just as much as the Exorcist will gladly pick up a spear and start swinging. The game is flexible, and happy enough to let you use whichever weapon you choose to, as opposed to certain other RPGs that might insist that the Mage, and only the Mage, can use a certain weapon, typically a staff or a wand. However, instead of this being the case, it's the unique skill trees per character that tend to be the defining characteristic of the class. And yes, if you do choose to use the talismans with the Exorcist style of skill tree, it will work to your favour, just as much as spears and swords tend to lend themselves more to the Adept. But it's nice to know that you don't have to use them if you don't want to, you're allowed the freedom of choice.
Holy fuck.
However, with that being said, it's also worth noting that in its current build, Ghostlore's difficulty is very much dictated by your chosen class. my first run as the melee-focused adept was one that could be genuinely challenging. You'd run out of health pretty damn fast and tend to have to rely more on your maneuverability and quick thinking, striking some critical hits as fast as you can before then backing off to reposition yourself. Strike again, reposition, rinse and repeat. But then you have a class such as the Exorcist, again aka the Mage, which is a class type that I typically don't tend to have much interest in, but I figured, fuck it, I might as well give it a go for my second run. And after a solid 6 or 7 hours of having played so defensively as the Adept, in stepping into the shoes of the Exorcist, I suddenly found that I was a god. By comparison to the Adept, the Exorcist is ridiculously overpowered. You will lay waste to literally everything in sight, and while you're not quite invincible, as there were still the odd challenges to overcome, the Seeker Talismans combined with summoning spells and some extremely useful passive spells all render the Exorcist a massive force to behold. But don't get me wrong, I don't mean this to imply that the Exorcist isn't a fun class to play with, because on the contrary, the implementation of magic spells alongside mercilessly flinging talismans into the forehead of everything in sight was a pretty exhilarating change of pace from the Adept. I had a lot of fun in my second run as the Exorcist, perhaps even more so than my first run. To cover a few things on a broader note, you're also granted additional upgrades such as equipment gems, scarves, hats, shields, and amulets, which all offer varying degrees of enhancement to your character traits, such as your luck in finding better items, the amount of gold you'll scavenge, or simply boosting your health and attack power. There's a lot of wiggle room here to tweak the character build to your liking, depending on which class you went for at the start of the game, which is a fact only further reinforced by one of Ghostlore's most interesting mechanics, the glyph system. This is where things just completely go all in for customization on whichever type of class build you want to be. As you continue onwards, you'll gradually accumulate glyphs that either boost health, your skill damage, melee damage, your accuracy, and so forth. And when combined with some of the stronger glyphs that actually then further enhance those that might surround it, the world's pretty much your oyster on whatever you want to be. Now, one thing I will absolutely commend the game for, which by this point I hope has been obvious from the footage, is the fact that this game looks downright beautiful at times. Even at the very first location of the game, after getting dropped into a flame-drenched village under siege by some nasty supernatural assailants, you're immediately treated to a taste of the lush, wonderfully colourful art style that you'll be seeing a lot of throughout Ghostlore. Rich fields and woodlands of greens, yellows, reds and orange, the moody atmospheric temple or the sandy port area alive with vegetation and vibrant trees, or even the towns themselves. A lot of this game is really pretty. And the fact that Ghostlore also happens to have a day-night cycle really only further enhances this factor even more, as it brings in some rather welcome visual aesthetic variety into the mix if you happen to end up getting stuck in one single area for a lengthy amount of time. Without that subtle change in colour tone and shading, some of these areas do risk losing their charm after the 10th time a boss has made mincemeat out of you. For example, while I like the creepy cemetery a lot and it is kind of one of my favourite areas, a solid 90% of your time working through it is just dark, foggy nothingness. And it's appropriately spooky for the first 15 to 30 minutes, but kinda starts to drag after a while. Okay, so for now that's really all I've got to say in terms of an early impression of this game. Like I said, this isn't really a full review, just some initial thoughts and feelings from my time spent with it. I haven't really touched on the story because, to be honest, aside from the primary quest giver, there really wasn't much of an overarching narrative throughout the game. The combat, visual style, and class customization is absolutely where Ghostlore shines. However, if the final release build does happen to have a more established story, I would be interested in seeing where it might end up going. The developers have created a very interesting world here. One that kind of doesn't make sense at times. I love how traditional everything looks, but then you're round a corner and there's like a speedboat cruise liner looking thing, and it's just strange. I want to know more about this world. I like where the developers are going with this. Also, to briefly touch on the game's music, while I like what is currently in place, in particular the cemetery theme, which again is probably my favourite piece of music from the soundtrack, I would have liked to have seen some dynamic shifts in tone when changing from a non-combat to a combat situation, especially with the Sandyport town area. Throughout your entire time there, it's just a mellowed out acoustic guitar casually ticking over a loop, which is nice and all, but it can at times feel a little bit out of place if you happen to be slaughtering enemies with an increasingly high frequency. A piece of soundtrack with a little bit more energy, ready and waiting to come in whenever the player engages in combat situations, would have been a fairly nice change of pace. But again, take everything I say here with a grain of salt. Some of the things I say here may very well be things already in the mix for further updates, and ultimately in spite of any of them, I still like Ghostlore a lot. I would honestly recommend it to anyone who enjoys the action RPG thing, especially if you happen to be a Diablo fan. It's full to the brim with opportunity to play this thing however you specifically want to, and for the 15 to 20 hours that I spent with it, I had a good time. As always when these things do come around, I would like to offer a massive thank you to the developer for the opportunity to cover Ghostlore, and on the subject of thank yous, I also have to say another to my wonderful supporters over on Patreon, in particular the current highest tiers, Game Master, Dark Raptor 86, and BFD Survivor. Thank you so much for your support. I'll see you on the next review.